You press a button on a gas stove or turn the key in a car's ignition, and a tiny, controlled explosion happens instantly. We've tamed this chemical power so thoroughly that it's now just a background noise in our comfortable lives, a simple click to boil water or drive to the grocery store. But what if that same click was once the most terrifying secret on the planet? For over 1,000 years, this reaction wasn't a convenience. It was a power that could punch through steel armor and turn stone fortresses into dust. The people who first stumbled upon this formula weren't generals or weapon designers. They were actually trying to find a way to live forever. Talk about a massive career pivot. This accidental discovery of fire medicine provided the spark that led to the invention of the gun, and it all started with a group of alchemists who very nearly blew their own faces off. The journey began in 9th century China, in laboratories where alchemists were mixing minerals in a desperate search for an elixir of immortality. They combined 3 specific ingredients: saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. In the simplest chemical terms, the saltpeter functioned as an oxidizer, releasing a rapid burst of oxygen when heated, which fed an extremely fast combustion of the charcoal and sulfur. The ratio? Roughly 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. Instead of a potion for eternal life, they created a volatile mixture that exploded, singeing their beards and burning down their workshops. They called it huoyao, or fire medicine. Let's be clear, this is probably the worst cough syrup in human history. It was a classic irony. A substance meant to grant life became the most efficient engine of death ever created. Can you picture the look on their faces when their immortality juice turned into a fireball? For generations, this fire medicine was little more than a spectacle, used for fireworks to scare away evil spirits with noise and light. It was more about the boom and the flash than actual combat. That changed in the 10th century when military engineers during the Song dynasty realized this volatile powder could be channeled into something much more aggressive. They created the huoyao, or fire lance. The design? Brutally simple: a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder and debris, strapped to the end of a traditional spear. During close-quarters combat, the user would light the fuse, and the tube would spew a jet of flame and burning shards at anyone within reach. It was basically a flamethrower on a stick. The psychological impact was arguably more dangerous than the physical damage. You're a soldier trained for years to fight with a blade, and suddenly, the guy across from you has a spear that spits fire. At the Siege of Da'an in 1132, defenders used these flaming spears to scorch and disorient attackers climbing their walls. It worked exactly as intended. Soon, engineers began stuffing lead pellets and pottery shards into the tubes, turning a simple flamethrower into a weapon that flung projectiles with lethal force. This was the big conceptual leap, shifting the purpose of a weapon from just being scary to actually delivering penetrating injury from a distance. However, bamboo has a serious problem. It's not exactly built to handle a massive explosion. Gunpowder combustion creates a violent expansion of gas, and if the charge was too strong, the bamboo would burst, likely injuring the person holding it. By the 13th century, craftsmen solved this by casting tubes out of bronze and iron. This shift to metal was the moment the hand cannon was born. These heavy devices used the full force of expanding gas to launch a single, solid projectile. By the time the Mongols encountered these weapons, they recognized the potential and carried gunpowder weaponry westward, spreading a Chinese invention across Eurasia faster than a modern viral video. When gunpowder reached Europe in the late 13th century, it landed in a world dominated by the feudal order, a society built around the superiority of the mounted knight and the stone castle. Early European hand cannons were crude and difficult to use. You needed one hand to steady the pole, and another to apply a smoldering match to a small hole. It was awkward, it was slow, and you had to hope with a lot of optimism that the projectile would actually go where you wanted it to. But even in this primitive form, the weapon carried a power that traditional gear simply could not match. A relatively cheap firearm in the hands of an untrained peasant could now neutralize a knight who had spent a lifetime and a fortune on his armor and training. The heavy steel plates that once made a knight invincible were now easily pierced by a lead ball driven by the force of chemistry. It was the ultimate system update that the knights never saw coming. How do you think those fancy aristocrats felt when a guy with a burning stick ruined their 20-year training program in 2 seconds? This technological shift forced a total redesign of human architecture. Traditional castles with tall, thin walls were meant to keep people out, but they were helpless against the growing power of heavy cannons. Military engineers had to develop the star fort, with low, thick, angled walls specifically designed to absorb and deflect cannon fire. The medieval castle, that iconic symbol of power, was effectively killed by a weapon that started in a lab looking for medicine. The most critical leap in making the gun a practical tool happened in the late 15th century with the invention of the matchlock mechanism. Before this, firing a gun was a clumsy two-person job. The matchlock solved this by attaching a slow-burning cord to a curved lever called a serpentine. Pulling the trigger lowered the burning cord into a pan of priming powder, igniting the main charge automatically. This freed the soldier to use both hands to steady and aim the weapon. It was the first mechanical firing device in history. Finally, a soldier could actually aim at a moving target instead of just pointing in a general direction and praying. As reliable as the matchlock was, it had a persistent weakness. It required a constant, open flame. This made it nearly useless in the rain, and dangerous to carry around open barrels of gunpowder. Think of it as the 15th century version of searching for a phone charger. But instead of losing your social media feed, you lost your ability to defend yourself from a charging army. This led to the development of the flintlock in the early 17th century. By using a spring-loaded hammer to strike a piece of flint against a steel plate, it generated a shower of sparks that ignited the powder instantly. It was faster, safer, and worked in poor weather. By the time of the American Revolution, the flintlock musket was the standard tool of war, often paired with a bayonet which turned the gun into a spear for when things got personal. Looking back at this journey, the invention of the gun is a story of incremental fixes to practical problems. No single genius woke up and decided to build a rifle. Instead, a group of people looking for eternal life stumbled onto a violent chemical reaction. Then, soldiers realized that reaction could be channeled through a tube. Then, engineers realized metal was better than bamboo, and mechanical triggers were better than handheld torches. Every step was a response to a failure that came before it. We have moved so far beyond those early bronze tubes that we now have weapons that would be unrecognizable to a Song Dynasty soldier. We live in a world where the power of the spark is controlled with surgical precision, but there is a lasting humor in the fact that the most consequential weapon in history began its life as a failed pharmaceutical experiment. We never did find that potion for immortality, but we were remarkably successful at creating a device that makes living forever much harder. The next time you use a lighter to start a candle, or hear the click of a gas stove, take a second to appreciate the history behind that tiny spark. It is the same chemistry that once singed the beards of alchemists and leveled the walls of empires. Our ancestors spent centuries babysitting smoldering cords and smashing rocks together so that we could eventually have a world where the power of thunder is just a button push away. Just be grateful that when you want to cook dinner today, you don't have to worry about your stove exploding and taking your eyebrows with it. That was a risk the early pioneers of the fire lance had to take every day. After building entire empires while managing an open flame in the rain, paying a high gas bill doesn't sound quite as terrifying. At least today, if the ignition fails, the only thing that might eat you is a bit of hunger, not a charging knight on a 1,000-pound horse. And nobody had to ask, who's paying for dinner, when everyone was just trying not to get scorched by their own weapon.